Caribbean medical schools have been a very popular option for students in Canada and the US, but there isn't much information on them, so not many people know exactly what they're like. That's why on the MedBoys podcast, we've brought on the perfect person for this. Darren Ramcharan, a fourth-year medical student at St. James School of Medicine, a renowned Caribbean medical school. How are you doing today, Darren?
Hey, Rochelle, thanks for introducing me. Doing great. Just wrapped up with one of my licensing exams, so now I'm kind of in a lull of preparing for my next round of rotations, actually.
That's great to hear, Darren. And I can imagine how hard those are. It's probably one of the hardest tests you've ever written in your life. Let's just start off by, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to Caribbean Med?
Yeah, so as Rochelle mentioned, I'm currently a fourth year medical student at St. James School of Medicine, based out of Illinois. I did my undergrad here in Canada, actually at Western University, doing a double major in biology and genetics. And how I started my journey in Caribbean schools was actually I had a few friends in undergrad that applied and were located at various different islands and schools in the Caribbean just before I graduated myself from undergrad. And so it was kind of on my radar. Hey, like there's a lot of people doing this. I know it's super competitive to get into the Canadian schools, especially around that time. That's when they changed the MCAT. So I was like, let me throw my hat in the ring, see what happens. And lo and behold, I got an acceptance. Before I even wrote my MCAT, I was lucky enough to get into a school that didn't require it at the time. And here I am now, 4 years later.
That's amazing to hear. And like you mentioned, it's very hard to get into medical school to begin with, and then comes residency after. And there's a lot of rumors that go around, and like Russell mentioned, there isn't a lot of information around about international medical graduates. So I wanted to ask you, what could an IMG do from the Caribbean to increase their chances for residency placements in North America in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So applying to residency, just like it is here with CARMS in Canada, in the US, they use the NRMP, National Residency Match Program. And it really comes down to a whole bunch of factors, and I believe how you look overall as a candidate. So obviously, licensing exams, you apply after you've written your first two licensing exams for the US. But there's other components like LORs, personal statements, and also your clinical experience that you've had, your hands-on experience. So all of those things play a very large role in how a program might view you as a candidate. Obviously, having good test scores is a huge advantage. Having a lot of hands-on clinical experience in the US or Canada itself, depending on where you want to practice, is a huge advantage. And just with the changing landscape of licensing exams, those letters of recommendation and personal statement are really becoming a huge factor in whether or not people match to their desired programs. And then obviously the cherry on top of all that is if you get offered an interview, how well you perform this interview for each individual program.
So, given what you said, would you say that it's realistic to aim for a competitive residency position like neurosurgery if you are studying in the Caribbean Med?
It's definitely attainable. I'll say that. So actually, just grabbing a couple numbers from 2022's NRMP match data, there was actually 25 non-US IMG students, so non-US citizen international medical graduate students who matched to neurosurgery. But when you look at it as a product of the whole, that only represented like 0.4% of that whole match category. So while they do make up a smaller proportion of these more competitive specialties, it is definitely attainable. Depending on what your experience and your background is, I'm sure there's a multifactorial consideration that goes into play with some of these more competitive specialties, but it's not off the board.
And that definitely is true for Canadian or US med schools as well. Like you could be in one of these and still not get into neurosurgery or a really competitive specialty just because of the competition. So I think it's not good to just write it off just because you're at a Caribbean school. So I wanted to ask you, how does Caribbean medical education actually work? How is it split up between the 2 years of pre-clerkship and then clerkship? And is there anything you'd like to tell us that's interesting?
Yeah. So a lot of the Caribbean programs try to mirror the curriculums and the same type of structure that they use for the US medical systems. So, like you mentioned, your first 2 years usually take part on the in the Caribbean, whatever island you're on. So, my school was actually fortunate enough to have two campuses in the Caribbean, one in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and one in Anguilla. So, I spent my first 2 years in Anguilla doing my basic sciences training. It actually consisted of 4-month semesters, and I wrote various board licensing exams in preparation for my first big licensing exam, which is the USMLE Step 1. And then afterwards, you complete your second 2 years doing hands-on clinical practice in the United States. So for me, I'm in the last leg here, my last 4 months of rotations, trying to schedule those out. But I completed my first 16 months in Chicago over the last year and a half.
A lot of work, as usual, as you'd expect from a medical school. So I know you're in fourth year now of your medical school. So could you just tell me what your normal day looks like in medical school?
Yeah, it really depends on what stage you're at. So when I was in the Caribbean doing my basic sciences curriculum, those look like 8 to 5 days, Monday through Friday, doing lectures, and then after school time, is your downtime, your study time, and same with on weekends. Every month we do a set of miniature exams in preparation for board exams at the end of each semester. And it's pretty typical, I would say, for most of the Caribbean schools, that kind of structure to have. Some of them do have different lengths of semesters that they break up. So that can vary depending on which school in particular you're going to, but that's the general, I would say, workflow or routine that you have. In terms of doing clinical rotations, that really comes down to the specialty you're in. So, for example, some of my more outpatient-based rotations, like family medicine and psychiatry, were very relaxed schedules, usually 20 to 30-hour weeks. But then I had some schedules with like surgery, and that it could go up to like 40, 50 plus hours a week sometimes, depending on just how busy it was in terms of patient load. So you get a lot of variety in terms of how busy you are and what you're doing exactly, but a lot of it's balancing your time between study time and clinical time and downtime. It's really a balancing act and multitasking.
Man, that sounds actually crazy. I'm happy that you were able to manage that and deal with that insane workload. But one question that I was really trying to ask you was, in comparison to other international medical schools, at least relative to Canada and the US, like Ireland or Australia, why did you opt for Caribbean Med specifically over those other international medical schools?
So when I went to apply to medical schools, and this would have been towards, I guess, the end of the academic year in 2017, Australia wasn't actually too much on the radar. I didn't have a lot of friends that were interested in those programs or applying or entering those programs. Ireland, I did hear about, but at that time, I didn't hear about a lot of opportunity to do your clinical experience in Canada or the US as hands on as the Caribbean students were. I knew the Caribbean students were getting placed in various states and getting hands on practice, working on real patients and real hospital systems. So at that time, I think it was a much more popular move, albeit it was still not as widely known as it is today to go to the Caribbean. And there was a large variety of schools. So everyone talks about the big four schools that kind of were trailblazers in this whole process and now are very established in the US, which would be SABA, Ross, St. George, and American University of the Caribbean, based in St. Martin. So when I decided to go there, I just kind of, like I said before, decided to throw my hat in the ring, see what would happen. I had my MCAT scheduled that summer, came across a couple of schools that didn't require it, sent in applications, and I got my acceptance before I even wrote my MCAT. That's not the situation with a lot of the schools now. Their requirements are a lot more stringent, but at that time it seemed like a good way to go aside from dealing with the competitiveness of the Canadian application process.
Yeah, and you're right. Everything has gotten very stringent and competitive now. And I think a lot of opportunities are opening up elsewhere too, like in Poland and, as you said, Ireland and Australia. Any transition into medical school is hard, whether it's in the US or Canada, and you were going into a completely new thing. You said you had some friends that had some experience there, but how was that transition and how did you settle in?
So for me, it was actually a crazy story. I first went to move down to the Caribbean in Anguilla for the fall semester in 2017. And I was unfortunate enough to have experienced going through my first natural disaster. That's when the Hurricane Irma actually hit. So our semester got canceled. All the students got kind of stranded on the island for a week until we all were able to go back to our home countries or our other campus. So that transition was really eye-opening for me to experience, being in the middle of that whole experience. In general, though, going to the Caribbean and returning in January of 2018, it was a little bit of a lifestyle adjustment. The island where I was wasn't as developed as you would see in like North America or big cities that we have here. Very laid back, very friendly, tight knit community. Um, so it does take a lot of cultural adjustment, I think. And then also in the nature of med school, it takes a lot of lifestyle adjustment in terms of your work ethic and your time management as a student. So the jump from undergrad to medical school was a big shift for me. So I had to um, use these tools and skills in my tool belt that I hadn't really had to employ so intensely before in order to manage and balance all these extracurriculars along with my school load, along with trying to maintain like some sort of social life outside of all my academic endeavors.
So, not many people know this, but Caribbean medical schools actually have a very high dropout rate because of the rigorous testing. Can you speak on that, if there was any experience related to it, or maybe some of your classmates experienced something like that?
Yeah, I think the dropout rate is definitely something to be highlighted. It shouldn't be kind of shoved under a rug. And the reason I think that is because compared to the Canadian or the US system, there's a little bit more laxity in terms of the admission requirements for a lot of the Caribbean schools, which is why it becomes a very popular route because you have very good candidates that would otherwise probably be in a Canadian or US school going to the Caribbean because you're more guaranteed a spot there. And it's kind of a means and end story. But what that also means is that you have people from a very diverse background that are trying to transition into this new career and this very intensive curriculum. So, for example, when I started my class, we had a blend of students from both the US and Canada. And there was actually a good portion of the students that didn't come from a science background at all or medical background in their undergrad. We had a few people that were previous paramedics, people that were previous nurses in Canada, a couple of people from political science backgrounds. So the learning curve is very different for a lot of people. So I think in terms of the academic learning curve and then also with the lifestyle adjustment, it's a lot harder to adjust to for some people than others. And you see that in the matriculation rate of who starts versus who continues through the process at various stages.
I feel like that definitely brings a little bit of more understanding as to why the dropout rate is the way it is. So thank you very much for explaining that to our audience. And the next question I had was related to the same line of thought. So we all know that the tuition rate for Caribbean medical schools is very high, like most other medical schools in the world. And so are there any ways that you know of that students can pay for their tuition for those who may be financially struggling or who may not have the proper means to actually pay for their tuition?
Yeah, so a lot of, at least from my own personal experience, a lot of the major Canadian banks, so TD, BMO, RBC, Scotia, all have a verified list of abroad schools, medical schools that they're allowed to provide loans for. So a lot of the Canadian students were actually able to obtain these loans that would cover pretty much all of their tuition costs and some of their living costs throughout the 4 years. Um, I know there's similar systems in the States, and there's a lot of private loan companies and banks that also provide loans for these kind of schools in the States. So a lot of it comes down to doing your research and kind of asking around about rates and about what amount loan you're allowed to get for a school and whether or not the school you're applying to is actually on one of these lists. Because I feel like it's easy to fall into these pitfalls of you apply to a school that's brand new or doesn't have the accreditation or the certifications to be able to get one of these loans. So doing good background research before you apply, I think, is really key in making sure that you can obtain one of these financing options.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of these banks are becoming more aware because I thought Scotiabank was the one that started all of this, and now all of them are following suit with giving the line of credit for medical students. So I think that's really good. We'll include a link below. You glossed over this earlier about how the island that you were living on wasn't as developed as North America. And we've heard many other stories about this. We had a previous guest on called Dr. Parmar, and he also went to a Caribbean med school, but that was a long time ago. So how were living conditions, and how did you find living on the island for those 2 years you were there?
I actually found it quite enjoyable. The island I was on was, like I said, very small population, not a big tourist attraction year round, as some of the bigger islands are in the Caribbean. So it actually made it kind of a good environment for studying because you were either in school or you could spend your downtime just relaxing with friends at the beach or just enjoying the nice weather and going out and play sports. Me personally, I actually participated in their men's soccer league and a competitive volleyball league while I was in school on the island, with locals. So it was kind of good in that way. You get to immerse in a different culture and really experience something outside of your norm from North America. And I think it has its advantage because it does help you kind of learn these social skills that you kind of have to pick up as a future physician anyway, being able to interact with patients from different types of communities. So it's kind of like your first experience of here's another world outside of what you're accustomed to. I think in that way, it's kind of character building.
Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of misinformation on the internet, so it's good to hear this. But you've already given a lot of advice on people applying to the Caribbean. But if you had to give specific advice on people applying to the Caribbean now, what would you say?
If I had to give, let's say, three major lessons that I've learned is always do your background research before you take a next step. Whether it's looking into the school you're applying to, choosing your specialty, trying to schedule rotations at different hospitals. You want to do everything that's going to set you up for success. So a lot of the times, I think students are easily misled or not given enough information to make right decisions about how they should be planning their next steps in order to try and maximize their potential of getting interviews and getting matched for residency. Another part is because of the nature of the Caribbean schools, we don't have access, I think, a lot of the times to the facilities or the staff sometimes that the American and the Canadian schools do, where they have these very official affiliations with hospitals and universities. So a lot of the learning that gets done is outside of the classroom, I think. So a lot of it's self-directed learning. So time management and discipline really become key in terms of really nailing those board exams and learning the material and gaining those competencies that you get tested on constantly throughout the process. And my last one is be hopeful because Caribbean medical schools like don't have the same stigma they do before. There's a bunch of doctors in both Canada and the US that have come from Caribbean schools. I think based on the American Medical Association released some data last year after the 2022 match saying that 25% of physicians, licensed physicians right now in the US are actually international medical graduates. And of that 25%, the top country is India, which makes up 23%. And then after that is Caribbean students, which is 18%. So that would translate to about 4.5% of physicians in the US have come from Caribbean schools, which is a significant proportion. So don't think that the process is going to make you fall behind or kind of be a second bet for these programs. If you do well and you put yourself forward, put your best foot forward as like a good candidate, and like I said, all those different factors come together, you have a chance. You can do it. In like internal medicine and family medicine are specialties that are dominated by international medical graduates in the US right now. So there's a lot of opportunity out there for you to do what you want and get to your goals, even through the Caribbean.
Well, that's very inspirational. And I feel like a lot of people listening to this definitely resonate with that. And hopefully they'll make that step and they'll consider Caribbean Med based on what you've said. And there is the second lesson you mentioned, which is learning outside the classroom. I think that's a really important thing to touch on. And going along the same line of thought, uh, when it comes to clinical rotations, where did you actually do your clinical rotations, and how has your experience been in those clinical rotations?
So for me, so far, I've done everything in and around the city of Chicago. So I've done 16 months, as I mentioned before, of training in the city of Chicago at various hospitals and clinics, and I have to say I quite enjoyed it. They really like to let you get in there as confident as you're feeling and as much as you're willing to take on a challenge or learn a new skill. All of my preceptors and supervisors are always willing to teach and learn and give you feedback, let you try out different clinical skills, and they can be a hard ass at times, but I think it's with good intention that they want you to learn just how intensive the field is in real life as well in practice, not just as a student. They're trying to show you the professional side of it. So I think you're at no disadvantage there. Again, you might not have access to all these state-of-the-art facilities that some of the US students do, but I myself have actually even rotated with US students and residents and fellows in a lot of my rotations. So you kind of get a side effect benefit from that where you're working alongside the people that went through US training anyway. So you get the opportunity to learn from them and their skills and their knowledge base and their resources. Um, in that sense, you kind of get to catch up in whatever Caribbean schools might not have been able to provide for you immediately. So the game really changes after those first 2 years when you go into clinical rotations, where if you're at these sites that allow students to be involved in patient care and be involved in discussions and education, you really do level the playing field in a sense, I would say.
That's really good that you said there aren't that many affiliations, but it's good that at least there's some affiliations where you can actually practice in the US, because I'm sure it helps a lot with the letters of reference and also just getting to know people in the field so that when you do apply to residency, you have someone or some people who can stand up for you and make those things happen. So I think that's really good. And I think that's not something that's highlighted about Caribbean medical schools too much. So it's really good that you brought that up. And you also mentioned that the US curriculum is very similar to the Caribbean curriculum, which is why you also take the USMLE exams. Could you highlight how you prepared for those exams? Because we've heard they're like the MCAT on steroids, and they're very, very hard.
Yeah. So these exams actually, at the time I wrote the USMLE Step 1, it was rated the second hardest exam in the world. Um, and I believe that based on what it was like studying for it. So your first 2 years of basic sciences are basically your preparation for your Step 1 exam. After finishing on the island all my pre-qualification exams, I took a 5-month dedicated period to just really hone in on a lot of the material, build my own study schedule, and then I wrote the exam. The exam itself is really grueling because it tests a lot of mental stamina. It's 7 blocks of 40 questions, and you have an hour to do each question. So you're basically looking at diagnosing 280 patients in a span of 7.5, 8 hours, which just seems ridiculous. But it's all very applicable. And then your studying and learning from your clinical rotations is kind of where all that knowledge base expands to for your Step 2 CK, which is the second licensing exam. And that one is very similar setup, multiple choice format, 8 blocks, 40 questions, hour to do each block. But like I said, these are 3 and 4 order questions. So it's really important to be dedicated to your studying, learn the information not only broadly, but also in depth and detail, because you don't know what they're going to ask you that exam day. The exams are always different for people and they change around. So you can't ever predict what your exam is going to be like based on what somebody else said. So it really tests your knowledge in terms of how you can be competent and knowledgeable all around as a physician in different specialties.
It sounds terrifying, and I know you need a very good work ethic to get there. And you mentioned how you had to adjust your work ethic and your habits once you got into medical school. Can you give us some tips on how you changed that and how you went on to do that?
Yeah, because I think the nature of medical school, no matter where you do it, involves a lot of multitasking. Because aside from what you're doing for your day-to-day courses, there's extracurriculars that you're always trying to get involved with, things that can beef up your resume and your CV for residency applications. So one of the habits I really got into was using checklists. So I will, like, for example, for my dedicated studying periods for both my licensing exams, I created an Excel sheet for my entire 4 or 5 month period. And I broke down all my studying day to day, scheduling out what I wanted to do every single day leading up to the day of my exam. And it's just kind of like a good mental way to stay on track and not let yourself lag behind or get into the habit of, oh, I'll do all these questions today, I'll do all these hours of video, or I'll do all this reading today. It sets very specific goals for you to reach and very attainable. I try to be very realistic with my studying, allowing myself a day off, allowing myself evenings to have downtime and do other things. So it's also a balance because you can go a little stir crazy if you just try to have a very intensive studying period. So yeah, on a day-to-day basis, I still use them even outside of studying, checklists of things I want to get done every day. And it really just helps you stay on track with everything and get small goals accomplished, which overall helps you accomplish the larger goals.
Yeah, so all the information you gave there was very valuable. I feel like a lot of people who are struggling with their work, especially those of you who are an undergrad, this shows you that something as simple as making a checklist can really go a long way. So I feel like this question is something that you may get quite a lot, Darren. Have you thought of which specialty you wanted to go into? And has attending a Caribbean medical school changed your perception of that specialty in any way or affected your decision to go into that specialty?
I would say I definitely had these superficial impressions of what each specialty was, mostly based on shows like House, before going into medical school. And going to a Caribbean school, I don't think specifically has swayed my decision. I think it was more about my experience I had during clinical rotations, because I was very split between doing something in a surgical specialty or doing something more medically inclined. And after going through those rotations, I realized I really love the idea of internal medicine. It's one of those diversity physician roles where they kind of have to know everything about everything, and you're really putting everything that you've studied and trained for to use. So a lot of my electives that I've decided to do this previous year was different subspecialties in internal medicine. So gastroenterology, infectious disease, critical care, things like that. So internal medicine is really where my head's at right now, and that's where I've kind of geared a lot of my choices and a lot of my extracurriculars and a lot of my training towards over the last year, year and a half. Um, just because being in surgery completely dismayed all the illusions and that I had of it. The uh, work-life balance is very stressful, and I can see that. And the training and the residency process is also very grueling. So they kind of turned me off of that because I know that I like a little bit more work-life balance. And as much as I love the hands-on technical skills of surgery and being in the OR, internal medicine, that kind of mental challenge every day of problem solving and working as a team really came into play. So it really swayed my decision in that sense, where this like hands-on firsthand experience is really what made my decision.
And you are going in the direction of House by going internal medicine, although he does do every specialty, so it's a little different. But this is a related question. Have you thought about whether you want to stay in the US or come back to Canada at all?
Yeah, this is actually a question that I get asked a lot. For the time being, I'm planning on practicing in the US, just because in terms of residency processes, if I split my training between the US and Canada as a candidate, I kind of look uh, split in my decision. So I can't convince interviewer or program director that I'm committed to being in Canada or committed to being in the US. And just I think in the US, there's a lot more opportunity for you to subspecialize, especially in the field of internal medicine. And they have such, I think, wide array of facilities and educational opportunities that you might not see in Canada just because of the nature of their healthcare system and also just because of the much larger population that they have. So as of now, I'm planning on staying in the U.S. I've done all my training here, so I'm okay with the health system. I enjoy what I'm doing. I enjoy what I'm learning. I like seeing how the doctors operate, and they really have been influential in my decision as well in convincing me that you can be just as competent a physician no matter what country you're training or practicing in. So maybe down the road I'll decide to come back home, as my mom would say. But for now, I'm planning on staying in the U.S.
Well, I guess we'll be visiting Dr. Ramcharan in the US then.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
But besides your medical training or any clinical skills that you've learned, what is one thing that helped you the most out of this experience, this entire experience? What would you say is that one thing that you learned that has helped you outside of medical school as well?
I think not being afraid of challenges. Medical school is full of new experiences, challenging processes and steps, and again, doing medical school in the midst of a hurricane and then a pandemic, a lot of things were changing all at the same time. So you kind of have to roll with the punches and not be afraid to take on challenges and adjust and be adaptable in that sense in order to make things happen the way you want them to. Life is not without its challenges, and medical school just adds to those challenges even more. So don't be afraid of those challenges, take them head on, and make good decisions that'll help you in the long run.
All right, so I did a little bit of research on Korean med schools, and I noticed that on some of the websites, they say that you can finish your program in 3 years. So, according to your knowledge, is there a way you can accelerate the MD program, or is that specific to certain schools? Could you speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, I believe it's specific to certain schools, just depending on how they do their scheduling. So typically with American schools, they have a 4-year program. You do 2 semesters every year with a summer break. My school was actually one of the schools that wasn't like that. You do 20 months pretty much consecutively for your basic sciences, and then you can schedule rotations however you want for your clinical rotations, depending on what works best for your schedule. So if you were someone who went end to end and didn't really take any breaks or had no pandemic interruptions in between, it was somewhat attainable. You could finish my program into 3.5 years. Most programs, I would say, are not like that, but some of them do have accelerated versions of their programs where you can pretty much go continuously throughout 3 years without stopping, and you would have all of your basic requirements met in order to graduate and get your degree.
And yeah, that sounds very grueling to go 20
Yeah,
months.
I wouldn't recommend it. I wouldn't recommend a summer vacation is definitely a nice thing to have.
Definitely, definitely. I wanted to ask you about the application process you were talking about to the med schools. You said you didn't have to take the MCAT. Did you have to take an interview? And if you did, how did that go?
Yeah, so I still needed to apply with my transcripts for my undergrad, letters of recommendation, and a CV. And then they call you for an interview process. And that interview for me was maybe about half an hour long, where they asked me different questions about situations where I faced challenges or where I showed leadership. Very simple, ethical-based questions of, given this situation with a patient, what would your next plan of action or your next course of action be? So it was very different from any interview I'd experienced before in terms of the types of questions they were asking. But I felt like it was a very straightforward process and similar to what you would experience maybe at some Canadian and US schools as well.
And I wanted to ask you, if a Caribbean med student, let's say after applying to residencies, they do not match, what would their options be?
So the match process has like a built-in fail-safe called SOAP, where basically unfilled programs, the week of match, if on the Monday of match you find out you haven't matched, you can go and apply continuously throughout the week to these unfilled programs that have vacancies. And aside from that, if you don't match in one cycle, you're always free to apply next cycle because your licensing exam scores don't really expire once you've completed them all within a certain time frame. So there are so many stories of international students that apply to 2 or 3 cycles and then they finally match at a really good institution or at a program that they were interested in previously on their 4th attempt. So it's not out of the question. And again, it does happen because I believe this past match cycle in 2022, the match percentage rate for not for international medical graduates that were not U.S. citizens was 58.1%. So that still means approximately 42% of people that applied don't match. In previous years, it usually does stay around that high 50s to low 60s percentage range. So there is a large proportion of people that don't match, but a lot of those people do end up matching in subsequent match cycles.
That's good to hear. At least there's some fail safe. It's not like they just leave you by yourself and they're alone.
Yeah, no, you don't get abandoned in the process for sure.
Yeah, and just before we finish off, I wanted to ask you if you have anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about.
No, I think I've covered all, you guys have covered all the bases and the important things. Just keep an open mind to Caribbean med schools. If the US or Canada seems a little bit too daunting and competitive and you're looking to go study on a sunny beach somewhere, like I highly recommend it.
Well, that's all we have today on Caribbean medical schools. We hope that the valuable information that Darren has provided will help students make more informed decisions regarding such a massive moment in their life, and also help international medical graduates from the Caribbean navigate their match cycles. Thank you so much, Darren, for coming on. Please consider liking and subscribing for more videos like this, and reach out to us if you have any questions on the topic. See you next time.